All right, so here we have all our ingredients for our sourdough starter, guys. I have the organic whole grain rye flour and the premium all-purpose flour, which is unbleached. Now you notice I've got a mason jar here. That's a combination of whole grain rye and the premium all-purpose flour. So I like to pre-mix these and measure it all out. So we've got here 500 grams of the whole grain rye flour with 500 grams of the premium all-purpose flour. Now we just use the scales to measure an even quantity of those. So we've got 500 and 500 in the mason jar. This is going to save a lot of time later, so I don't have to worry about mixing flours and measuring all of that out. So that has some of its benefits, pre-mixing your flours. You want to make sure that everything is sterilized. So before you actually get down to start making everything for your sourdough starter and mixing your flour and your water, you want to make sure everything is sterile, because if it's not sterile, you can get some mold in the sourdough starter that you're trying to create and you'll have to start again. So what you'll basically need to do is just get some boiling hot water, put your utensils in there such as your fork, your knives. Make sure you give your mason jars a nice clean and sterilize them prior to putting your flours in as well. Now you'll notice here that we're using organic flour. Now the reason for this is we want the residual yeast or good bacteria that lives on the grains naturally. Non-organic flour has more pesticides than organic. So here is some sourdough starter that we've just got going about 5-10 minutes ago. What you want to do is you want to put your mason jar on top of the scales and use the pre-portioned rye and all-purpose flour that you've got into your mason jar at the back here. Put it on top of your scale. Put in 50 grams, measure out 50 grams of the flour into your mason jar that you've sterilized. And then you want to put in 50 grams of your natural spring water and give it a stir with a knife or a fork. Stir it around nicely and just leave it on your bench, and we'll come back for day one. All right, so the starter's been sitting here for about 13 hours now. Because it's cold where I live in Melbourne, Australia, there's no real heating. It's a bit cold this time of year. So I'm keeping my jar outside of the fridge. It's cold enough on the outside. Now, what you want to do is you want to make sure the sides of this jar are as clean as possible to prevent contamination. As you notice at the top there, that could possibly be our first signs of bubbles, which shows that the yeast looks like it's going to be activated, which is good. We want that natural yeast, which is the purpose of the sourdough starter. So at this stage, I'm going to leave it for, I'd say, probably another 12 hours. Make sure all that yeast is getting really active. You'll also notice that I've got a little piece of paper attached to the container here, just letting me know the weight of the mason jar, which is 488 grams. We do that because when we chuck it on the scales, the container weight will appear as well, and it'll make it hard for you to judge the weight of the sourdough that you're putting in. So I put the weight of the container written on the mason jar. So I'm going to leave this for at least another 12 hours, put my 50 grams of flour and water in, and come back and see if this is activated for day 2. So this is day 1 completed, so we're heading into day 2 now. You can see lots of bubbles there and the starter is nice and active. No mold because we've kept it nice and sterile. So we've left it out. It's not too cold, it's not too hot. The weather out here, the hotter it is in your house, the more active the starter will get. So that's going along really nicely. So what we're going to do is we are going to add another 50 grams of our rye and all-purpose flour mix and 50 grams of spring water. We're going to give this another stir. It's beautiful and nice and active, which is what we want. Then we'll come back for day 3 and we're going to repeat this process again. So as you can see here, the starter is still pretty active. It's got a lot of bubbles there. So today is probably our last opportunity to give it another feed. I'm not too keen on giving this a refresh right now. It still does have a fair bit of bubbles. It still does look fairly active. So we're going to give this one more feed of our 50 grams of our organic rye and all-purpose flour. Just get 50 grams in there. Don't worry if you make a bit of mess, guys, that's fine. We've got our 50 grams of mineral water here. Give this another stir with a sterilized fork or a spoon, remember, just with some hot water. We're going to add a little bit more flour because we added a little bit too much water then. So just balance it out a little bit. Don't worry if it's 50 grams of rye or 51 grams of water. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be that anal about it, but it has to be pretty close. Give this one last final stir.
We'll see how we go tomorrow. So we'll be using this starter or sourdough culture for our sourdough pizza bases, which is the Morphed hybrid dough. The dough is quite beautiful and has a really distinct taste with the pizza base. It has a really good flavour. So you'll notice with normal pizza doughs it won't really have much flavour, but us making this starter is going to give it something special. Alright, so we'll just chuck this lid on and leave it out, and we'll come back tomorrow and see how bubbly this is for day 4. So you can see all the bubbles there and how active that starter is. It also has a very, very nice sour smell as well. So this is done now. We're gonna get into the sourdough pizza making. We're gonna use some of this sourdough culture for that pizza. Whatever's we don't use, we'll just keep that in the fridge, and we can use the rest of the sourdough starter at a later stage to make another sourdough starter if we want it. Alright, so for our sourdough recipe, we're going to have 500 grams of bread flour, 7 grams of dry commercial yeast, which we've got here. We're just going to mix this with our water. We'll be chucking our sourdough culture in with the dry yeast and the water and give that a little bit of a stir to let that ferment. You'll be using 300 mils of water. This is going to be quite a soft, wet dough. 50 grams of olive oil as well. Some salt, about 1 teaspoon, and a caster sugar, 5 grams. So we're going to use bread flour, which is 00 flour, which is a higher quality flour. It's up to you what flour you use, but I do highly recommend that you use that to make your sourdough pizzas. The reason for this is because 00 flour is actually meant for Italian and pizza making. So it's very common for bakers and everyone to use it for their breads. So we're just measuring out our sourdough culture, which is from the starter that we've made before. We're going to measure that out to 220 grams. So we've got that there. Now we're just going to give that a nice stir. Make sure it's all evenly combined. Let it ferment and let the yeast grow as much as possible. Give it a nice thorough stir. Going to make sure it's all evenly combined. Add the sugar to this as well. The sugar is the friend of the yeast, so that's going to help it ferment nicely for you. So we're going to give that a quick stir. So that's been fermenting for 5 to 10 minutes now. Give a good chance for the yeast to grow. Now we're just going to add our plain flour, our bread and pizza flour, into our stainless steel bowl here with our salt, which we're keeping separated from our yeast and our sugar, because the salt is the enemy of the yeast. It'll attack it, and we don't want to kill the yeast, which is going to prevent it from rising and proofing nicely for us later on. So we're just going to add our flour in here, get all that done, throw our rubbish away. Don't mind the dog in the background. That is our turtle, my little beagle ear. So we're going to mix our wet mixture of our yeast, water and sugar in with our pizza flour. Use a spatula to combine this. You can use your hands, but because this is quite a wet dough, I don't really feel like getting my hands messy at this point in time anyway. So we're just going to start it off with the spatula, combine it as much as possible, and then we're going to add the rest of our liquid here. Just going to continue to mix this through as much as we can with the spatula. Keep folding it over and scraping the corners as much as we can. So I like to get those dry, crusty bits of flour off the outside of the bowl and bring it back to the center. So we're going to add about 50 grams of olive oil. I just go by feel. Doesn't have to be an exact measurement, but the exact measurements are there in the recipe if you did want to do that. The olive oil isn't so important to get it exact. It's more the yeast and the flour and the sourdough starter that's the important part. The olive oil is just going to help it keep nice and moist. So we're going to transfer this onto our stone bench top here. I'm just rubbing a bit of flour on the bench so that the dough won't stick for us. Scrape everything out of the bowl that we can, get it all in there, and now we're going to start giving this a nice beautiful knead. So I've got it all here on our bench. Now we're going to knead this, use our palms, be nice and firm. Don't be gentle with it. You really want to smash that yeast, the sugar, the flour, the olive oil, the salt. You want it all combined very nicely. Collect all that flour up off the bench. So because this is a really wet dough that we're using, I added a little bit of flour to the bench. I do that with most doughs. That's just going to stop it from sticking and make it a lot easier to knead for you. Because you're doing it by hand, you really don't have the machine to help you out. So do things to make it as easy for you as possible. Get everything in there, keep going. As you can see here, it's starting to get a little bit smoother. I just like to add a little bit of olive oil there, just make it a little bit moister. So we're going to continue to knead this quite heavily. I usually give this up to about 10 minutes really. It all depends on how firm you're kneading it with your hands. So this is about right now. So we're just going to use our plastic spatula here. People often use this to cut pizzas or pastries. It's quite a handy little tool. I recommend that you get one of these. If not, you can just use your hands to separate the dough. It's not a big deal. Now we're just going to fold this and roll this into little balls. Cut the rest of our dough. You can use your scales if you want them all the exact same size, but we're not going to do that here. Not too fussed about that. Just keep folding and working the dough under each other to get them into nice beautiful balls. And we're just going to add a touch of olive oil here, keep them nice and moist, and wrap them in Glad wrap so that they're not going to get any crusty bits while they're proofing. So we're going to leave that for an hour or two and come back and show you guys how to roll it out. Alright, so this has been proofing for a couple of hours now. I'm just going to take our Glad wrap off over the top here and use our little spatula to bring this up off the bench. It's just going to make it easier to take off and help the pizza continue to maintain its round shape. We use the Glad wrap to stop a crust from forming over the top. We don't want that, we want it nice and moist and easy to work with. So we're just going to grab this pizza base here and we're going to turn it in our hands like a steering wheel in the car, just to get it round and stretch out the dough a little bit there. And then we're going to place it straight onto our stone that we've got with some baking paper to prevent it from sticking. We're just going to work the dough around with our hands, just get it as flat as possible and moving it around to stretch out the dough, keeping as much air in there as possible. So we're just going to continue to work the dough until I get the desired thickness of the base that I'm after. Obviously, if you want a thicker base, you wouldn't stretch it out as much, and if you want a thinner base, you would stretch it out as much as possible. So we'll just continue to work that. What I'll do here is I'll cut off a little bit of dough off the side. If what happens is you notice that your dough might start to tear in the center, cut a bit off the sides and place it in the middle there. No one's going to know. It's not a big deal. It doesn't really matter at all. It's not going to affect any of the quality of your pizzas. Okay, so just continue to work it, get the shape that we want there. I'm about happy with that now. That's beautiful. It's got a fairly nice crust on it that we've created. So we're just going to start placing our toppings on now. So we've got our Napolitana sauce that we've spread over our pizza base here. It's got little bits of basil in it, as you can see. We're going to spread our pulled pork all over the pizza. Love a bit of beautiful pulled pork. You can just get this from your supermarket if you want. Some brown onion, some sliced onion that we're going to spread over there. Onion gives it a nice little crunch and a sweet taste once it's caramelized. Some bocconcini cheese, which is an Italian cheese. It's very beautiful and soft. It goes well with pizzas. Spread that over nicely. Some Parmesan cheese as well. So we've got two different types of cheeses there. That should give it a very unique flavor. Just going to get this in the oven now and show you guys how it went. So that's been in there for about 10 minutes now. The crust is nice and beautiful and firm. It's got a beautiful crunch to it. With your sourdough pizzas, you'll notice that the dough, when you bite into it, will have a nice sour taste that actually has a flavour, the pizza base, which is nice. We'll just sprinkle a bit of rocket over that to give it a bit of colour, a bit of flavour. The dough for your sourdough pizza bases will actually be nice and chewy as well. It won't just be bland. And that's it there, guys. So give that a good crack at home. Just going to slice into this now and have a piece. Been eating pizzas all week, so this has been fantastic. Enjoy. So this is the Napoli sauce demonstration. This is the sauce that we'll use for our pizza. Here are our ingredients. We've got some diced onion, which is got some crushed garlic through that we've prepared before, tomato paste, crushed tomatoes, salt, olive oil, and we've also got some basil and cracked pepper and sugar that's not in picture that we will add to this later. So let's just get straight into the physical demonstration for you guys. So we've got our pot that we've heated on our stovetop here. You want to add your oil to a hot pot. Once it moves around freely like it is, that indicates it's ready to start adding your onion. So we'll add our onion now. You don't want the oil to smoke because that'll leave a burnt taste in your sauce. You want to add the oil and then the onion just when the oil in the pot starts to move around freely. So that's frying nicely now. Just give this a stir with our wooden spoon. You don't want it too hot because your onion and your garlic will burn. So right now I do have this on a high heat, but we're just going to keep stirring it frequently. And we can adjust the heat as we go along to make sure that it's not going to get any burnt bits in it. Add a bit more oil. So I've been stirring this for about a minute or two. We've added our tomato paste now, which we're going to fry. This will add some more flavour to the sauce itself, so give it a nice fry. Just keep stirring there. Now once that's fragrant, your onions and your tomato paste, then you can start looking at adding your crushed tomatoes. So when you add the tomato paste is basically once you can have this really distinct sort of oniony garlic smell from your onions and it's really fragrant for you, that's when you add the tomato paste. Continue to fry that off until the paste becomes fragrant, and then you're going to add your crushed tomatoes, which we're going to do now. Adjusting the heat as you go along. Okay, it doesn't have to be on a high heat. I actually recommend that you don't do that. So now that we've got our crushed tomatoes in there, we've got 1 can in, 2 cans in. Now this is going to become quite thick because that's what we're after, the consistency we want for when we make our pizza bases. All right. So give this a nice stir. Once you've added your crushed tomatoes, it's okay to leave it on a high heat because you do want to bring that to the boil and then leave it on to a simmer. Putting it on a high heat will just allow it to heat quicker, but if you are going to leave it on a high heat like I'm doing here, notice that I'm stirring it frequently. That's so that it doesn't burn and get caught on the bottom. So once a fair bit of heat gets thrown into the sauce that we're creating there, that's when it's okay to turn down the heat. Now, traditional Napoli sauce will take up to 4 hours to cook. It's completely up to you if you want to do that. It'll bring out the most flavour the longer you leave it on the stove top and get all the sourness and bitterness that are out of the tomatoes. But that's why we've added the brown sugar, because that'll make that go away somewhat. All right. So we're going to leave this simmer for 4 hours, and then at the very end we'll add our basil. So this is the base sauce here that we're going to use for our pizza bases, which is going to be thicker. A PDF attachment with the ingredients and method to make this Napoli sauce will be included in the course as well for you guys. So guys, thank you for taking the class on how to make a sourdough pizza base as well as your Napolitana sauce. I hope you guys have learned something and have some new skills now to impress all your friends and family. I welcome all of your feedback, so leave it in the comment section below. Feel free to check out the PDF attachments that are in the class description as well, just for you to have some documentation of, the methods. If video wasn't enough for you, just something that you can get in your hand and read. Some people learn different ways, so you might find that more helpful. Anyway guys, until next time, I'll see you later.